It's hard to wrap your mind around how education has been impacted by COVID-19. In the province of Ontario, we're talking about 2 million kids. Studies show that the impact won't really be felt for decades to come. I spoke to Western University professor Prachi Shrivastava about what the recovery plan should look like and what comes next. Prachi, it's really nice to see you again. So I read this headline recently, and it said education is a shadow pandemic that could eclipse the health crisis and its impact.
When we think of it from that way, we actually do realize that the impact, both in terms of numbers of students and numbers of children that it affects, as well as the longer term consequences, are far going to outlive how we learn to control and live with the pandemic. And what we would like to avoid are the kinds of school closures and disruption that we've seen in the first two years, and certainly in the third academic year that we're in.
What you're saying is that right now we are living in a health crisis, but we're actually creating an education crisis that will have repercussions for years and maybe decades to come.
We're creating an economic and well-being crisis. So, education is very much integrated in terms of life opportunities, in terms of well-being, in terms of people's, life and their chances in life. So we saw a very quick revert to quote unquote emergency virtual learning without a clear plan in terms of what that curriculum was going to look like, without really thinking about how that was then going to be integrated into the next school year, and without making any revisions to the following school year or the school year after that.
You argued early in the pandemic for a Canadian COVID task force coordinated at the federal level to cover education as well as health, finance, and emergency preparedness. Why did you make that argument?
When you're in a protracted emergency situation, coordination is key. And really, what that does is to allow all the different constituencies, all the different public services to share information, and then, of course, to mobilize that information all the way through up to the grassroots level. If we had a federal Department of Education or some such ministry, then that might have been something that could have been done.
Do you think that was a lost opportunity?
Yes, we have one of the largest bureaucracies per capita in the world. That tells us we have capacity. We also are a G7 country. That means we're one of the largest economies in the world with many, many resources. We also, by the way, within the G7, have one of the smallest demographics of children to cater for in school. I'm not pointing fingers here at any one level of government, but what I am saying is the coordination in a decentralized system of governance, as we have in Canada, is key.
Well, you were quoted as saying it was very short sighted. And I could also see that there was very little planning or preparation around schooling, at least in Ontario. How different was Ontario's response to pandemic learning than other provinces?
Well, Ontario's response to school closures and education disruption was an outlier. We did an analysis across the country to see how all the provinces fared. In terms of school closures. And Ontario by far had the largest numbers of school closures, now at 28 weeks. I think now Quebec is like maybe 12 or 14 weeks. So we're about double that. If the government deems a particular sector or a particular service as essential, it requires all the things one would need to effectively taper down services in other sectors without completely bankrupting or decimating them, and making sure that we protect education and health. And that was not done. So that, school closures were very much the lever for potential control of the pandemic in the first and second year. And we saw that actually was not very effective in terms of cases and in terms of transmission. And I say this as somebody who has been looking at the inequity issues of the pandemic and who's been looking at education and income inequities and researching that for over 20 years. So I'm not deaf or blind to the real human costs, but there's a question around how do we prioritize? And that was not done in Ontario.
I'm curious to know how much kids absorbed during this, how much kids actually learned. Do we know?
it's clear that there have been learning losses in the areas of math and literacy. It could be anywhere between 2 months to 2 years, depending on the system, depending on the subject, depending on the length of closures. But it's clear that there have been losses in certain instances, racialized students in certain instances, of course, children with special needs whose really needs were not being met at all through this emergency virtual instruction period, that children coming from lesser educated households, children coming from neighborhoods that are generally more deprived.
That chat was part of The Thread hosted by me. And if you want to see more videos, you can look here and here. Subscribe to our channel or follow us on Instagram at TVO The Thread. See you next time.